Ethan Marlowe stepped into the tiny New York diner with the same sharp presence he carried into every boardroom, but here it felt almost strange, like a businessman wandering into someone's living room. The place smelled of bacon and old coffee pots, the kind of place people usually visited for comfort, not evaluation. And yet here he was, pulling out a sleek silver stopwatch before even sitting down. He ordered the cheapest meal in the menu, not because he wanted it, but because its low price point gave him the clearest baseline to judge performance, efficiency, and waste. While the waitress scribbled the order, he pressed the start button, the soft beep loud enough to make a few customers glance over. It was almost impossible to ignore the tension around him, as if the air shifted the moment he walked in. The cook peeked through the service window, confused, and one of the waiters nudged the other, quietly wondering why someone who looked like he belonged on the cover of a financial magazine would be timing a scrambled egg plate. Ethan didn't notice any of that. His entire focus was on the ticking seconds and the system he believed ruled the world. Yet beneath that cold concentration, there was the faintest tremor of something else, a curiosity he didn't admit even to himself, a strange interest in how a small diner might reveal a weakness in the bigger machine he had built. And even though no one had spoken to him yet, he felt eyes on him asking silently what a man like him was hiding behind that tight jaw and perfectly pressed suit. Ethan's mind rarely rested, not even in moments like this where most people would relax into the warm hum of a morning crowd. His thoughts always drifted to screens filled with charts, blinking dashboards, and performance curves that rose or fell depending on how many seconds an employee saved during their shift. He had built an empire on the belief that time was the only true currency, and anything that slowed progress was waste. Even outside the office, those numbers followed him like shadows, whispering reminders of everything he had to improve, tighten, or demand. He prided himself on running his company with the precision of a machine, but somewhere deep inside, a quiet emptiness waited, an emptiness created by years of ignoring what didn't fit inside a spreadsheet. That was why he had come here today. This diner, with its squeaky stools and handwritten specials, was a petri dish for the inefficiency he wanted to measure. If he found weaknesses here, he could tighten new rules company-wide. The thought gave him the same satisfaction as hitting a target on one of his charts. And yet something in the air, some soft human rhythm he wasn't used to, unsettled him just enough to raise a silent question he didn't want to confront. Still, he clung to the comfort of his numbers, scanning the room for the flaw he was certain he would find. The waitress, Grace Turner, returned with a quiet smile and a calmness Ethan found almost irritating. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with tired eyes but an easy warmth in her voice. She began entering his order into the small register, but before she finished, she paused and turned toward an elderly woman who had just stepped in and was struggling to balance her purse and cane. Without hesitation, Grace set the notepad aside and hurried over, guiding the woman to a booth with the gentleness of someone who had done it 1,000 times without ever seeing it as a burden. Ethan's jaw tightened as he glanced at his timer, watching the seconds slip away. He expected to feel confirmation of his beliefs, yet instead felt something closer to irritation mixed with confusion. Moments later, while she poured water for another table, a child nearby burst into tears over a fallen pancake. Grace crouched beside him, wiping his little face with a napkin and whispering something soft enough to make him giggle through his sniffles. The entire diner seemed to relax around her presence. Ethan, however, couldn't understand how someone could stop twice in the middle of an order and still believe they were doing their job correctly. But beneath that irritation, a different kind of tension stirred, because watching her care for others made something in him shift, something small but undeniable, and he didn't yet know if he liked that feeling. When Grace returned to Ethan's table, she carried his plate with both hands, steady and precise. The steam rising from the eggs proved the dish was fresh off the stove, not a second too cold, not rushed either. She placed it in front of him without explaining, without apologizing for the pauses, simply offering the meal with sincerity that felt like an unexpected jolt. Ethan blinked at the plate, then at his timer, then at her. According to everything he believed, the food should have been late, sloppy, or cold. Yet it was perfect, better than perfect. There was care in the way it was presented, a quality he couldn't quantify but felt sharply. Grace smiled, unaware of the storm brewing inside him, and walked away to help someone else without a trace of hurry or guilt. Ethan tried to return to the comfort of his numbers, but they suddenly felt off, as if the logic behind them had a crack he couldn't ignore. Every second she lost helping someone had somehow transformed into value he couldn't measure. He stabbed at his food, not hungry but needing to prove something to himself. But each bite tasted like another contradiction, a reminder that maybe speed wasn't the only measure of excellence. He didn't want to admit it, yet the idea pressed deeper, tugging at something tightly sealed inside him. By the time Ethan walked out of the diner, the stopwatch still glowing in his hand, a strange heaviness sat in his chest. The numbers stared back at him, refusing to match the quality of the experience he had just received. For the first time in years, a metric didn't tell the full story. He sat inside his car and closed the door, shutting out the noise of the street. But he couldn't shut out what he had seen. Every detail replayed in his mind: the elderly woman's relieved smile, the child's soft laughter after stopping his tears, the way Grace carried the plate without rushing, yet somehow arriving at the exact right moment. Ethan leaned back, overwhelmed by a feeling he hadn't expected. Doubt, a deep, unsettling doubt in the very system he had dedicated his life to building. He tried to breathe it away, to bury it under charts and KPIs, but the crack had already formed, widening with each breath. Something inside him had shifted, something that couldn't be undone now that he had witnessed it. He didn't know what this meant for him, for his company, or for the empire built on seconds, but he knew one thing clearly: he had to look closer. And that single decision, born quietly in the front seat of his luxury car, was about to send him down a path that would change everything he believed. Before we keep going, take a second and pause the video to tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Moments like the one Ethan is about to face hit people differently depending on their own work experiences. So drop your city or state down there and come right back, because what happens next says a lot about pressure, kindness, and what truly matters in a workplace. Ethan carried the weight of that diner moment with him as he walked through the glass doors of his headquarters the next morning. The building felt different now, colder than he remembered, almost as if he had stepped inside the very system he'd built without seeing its cracks before. Instead of announcing his arrival, he moved quietly through the different departments, letting the rhythm of the place speak for itself. Workers rushed across hallways without greeting each other, eyes glued to screens that counted their steps, their minutes, their mistakes. At one point he watched a customer in the lobby, clearly lost, holding a clipboard and looking for help, but 3 employees walked right past him, too afraid to lose performance points by stopping. Ethan felt a sting behind his ribs. For years he had seen these moments as efficiency. Now he saw something else: fear, disconnection, the absence of small human gestures he had once dismissed as waste. He walked into the call center floor, and the speed of the conversation struck him immediately. Representatives spoke so fast he wondered how customers even kept up. A woman waved her hand in the air to get a supervisor's attention, but no one stopped. Her screen flashed red, meaning her call time had gone too long, and she bit her lip hard, trying to hold back frustration. Ethan recognized that look. He had seen it before in young employees who wanted to help people but felt trapped between compassion and the numbers that judged them. He moved on, trying to ignore the growing knot in his stomach, but everywhere he turned, he found another sign of how deeply his rules had shaped the place. People didn't look tired from work. They looked tired from being measured every second. In the warehouse, he watched a man nearly sprint between shelves to meet a timing target on his handheld device. Another co-worker dropped a box, and instead of helping, 3 others hesitated, checking the timers mounted on their carts, before deciding they couldn't afford to lose points. The box sat on the floor for almost a full minute before anyone finally picked it up. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling something inside him fold over itself. He had always believed that pressure made people stronger, more focused, more efficient. But the faces around him told a different story, one filled with tension lines and shortened breaths. For the first time, he wondered if he had confused stress with productivity. As he turned a corner into the customer service lounge, he saw a young employee sitting on a bench with her hands shaking around a cup of water. She tried to hide her face when someone walked by, but tears slipped out anyway. Her supervisor approached, looking irritated, asking why she was off the floor during peak hours. The employee stammered something about hitting her limit, that she couldn't keep rushing callers who needed more time. Ethan watched the exchange quietly, unnoticed. When the supervisor walked away, the young woman crumpled forward, her breath unsteady to the point she had to put her head between her knees. That sight pierced him deeper than any report ever had. His stopwatch rules had created this moment. His charts, his targets, his idea of perfection had pushed her to a breaking point. Ethan stepped back, heart heavy, a new kind of fear settling in. He had come to see whether Grace's way of working existed anywhere in his empire, any small corner where kindness could survive. But now he saw something bigger, something painful and impossible to ignore. He saw what happened when people were forced to choose between being human and being fast. And standing there, watching that young woman shake, he felt a truth unfold inside him that he wasn't ready for. If one employee reached this point, how many others were right behind her, hiding it better, collapsing in silence? The question stayed with him, heavier than any KPI he had ever reviewed, and it followed him down the hallway like a shadow, hinting that what he had discovered was only the beginning of a much deeper problem he had yet to face. Ethan walked farther into the building with the image of the young woman breaking down still heavy in his mind, and he felt something inside him soften in a way he didn't expect. Instead of heading straight to his office, he slipped into a small side hallway where a few employees were taking short breaks between tasks. He sat beside one of them, a woman named Marisol, who looked startled when she realized who had joined her. She tried to straighten her uniform and hide the exhaustion on her face, but Ethan spoke gently, asking how things were going, not as a boss checking metrics, but as a person trying to understand what he had missed. Marisol hesitated, glancing toward the cameras, then toward the door, unsure if honesty was safe. When he reassured her that their conversation was private, she finally let out a breath she had been holding for a long time and admitted something that stung him more than he expected. She said she often hid moments of helping customers because the system punished slowing down. She described how she pretended not to see things that needed care just to avoid losing points. Her voice cracked as she told him it made her feel cold, almost ashamed, like she was being trained to stop caring. Ethan felt the weight of her words settle on him, and for the first time he heard the consequences of his rules without the filter of a boardroom presentation. He thanked her quietly and moved to another department, this time approaching a young man named Trevor, who had been with the company for only a few months. Trevor lowered his voice as soon as Ethan asked what the work felt like day to day. He confessed that workers often helped each other behind the system's back, covering for one another by clicking ready on their timers while someone else attended a frustrated customer or cleaned up a spill. He said it felt risky every time, but it also felt like the only way to stop the place from turning into something even colder than it already was. Ethan listened, nodding, absorbing each detail like a bruise forming slow and deep. These weren't numbers. These were people trying to do good while hiding from a machine he had created. That truth burned through him, peeling back years of pride he once felt in being a visionary leader. When he finally made his way toward the executive wing, he found Daniel Price waiting for him near the elevator, arms crossed, posture confident in a way that felt rehearsed. Daniel greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and asked if he was ready for the morning strategy briefing. Ethan paused, still carrying the voices he had just heard, and replied that he needed to talk about what he was seeing across the building. Daniel's smile faded. Ethan shared gently but firmly that employee after employee felt punished for being helpful, that the system encouraged them to ignore humanity just to survive the metrics. For a second, something flickered across Daniel's face, maybe surprise or maybe annoyance, but then it hardened. He brushed it off, saying that everyone always complained about pressure, that it was the cost of high performance. Ethan pushed again, explaining that what he saw wasn't ambition, it was fear, real fear, the kind that drains motivation and burns people out. Daniel's jaw tightened, and he leaned in slightly as if letting him in on some final truth. Moments like this make a lot of people stop and think about the jobs they've had, the pressure they've felt, and the things they were afraid to say out loud. If anyone listening has ever felt stuck between doing what's right and doing what keeps them safe at work, they're not alone. Stories like Ethan's hit different when they remind us how many people around the world face the same kind of silent pressure every day, and hearing others in the comments share their experiences often helps everyone feel a little more understood, a little less alone. Daniel stepped back and delivered a line that landed like a weight. Humanity doesn't scale. He said it calmly, as if it were just another business truth, expecting Ethan to accept it the way he had accepted so many phrases in the past. But now that Ethan had heard the real voices behind the metrics, the words didn't sit right. They stirred something that couldn't be pushed aside anymore. He didn't argue back yet, he wasn't ready. Instead, he walked away slowly, carrying all the things he had learned, all the things he needed to face. wondering how much more damage he would uncover if he kept digging and whether he had the courage to push back against a system built in his own image. Ethan closed the door to his office with a slow, heavy motion, like someone bracing themselves before lifting something they once believed would be light. The voices of the employees he had spoken to were still fresh in his mind, almost echoing in the quiet room. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop and pulled up the company's data dashboard, expecting to find the same clean graphs and rising numbers that had always reassured him. Instead, as he layered different reports together, strange patterns began to show. Areas with the fastest response times had the highest turnover rates. Departments with the most efficient call durations had the most customer complaints. Even teams praised for hitting record speed targets had the lowest internal satisfaction scores, notes hidden inside HR files that he had never bothered to open before. He clicked through page after page, watching the truth surface in ways he had never let himself see. The system wasn't just strict, it was hurting people. It was pushing them to move faster than they could breathe, stealing the kindness they naturally carried. And suddenly Grace's face flashed in his mind, the soft way she had helped the elderly woman, the calm way she had soothed the crying child, and how none of that had stopped her from bringing him a perfect hot plate. Her way of working wasn't a weakness, it was everything his company was missing. He leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose, and felt the weight of the responsibility settle deeper. What he saw on the screen didn't match the story he had been telling himself for years. There was no argument left to explain it away. Numbers he had once trusted now pointed straight at the problem, and that problem was the very set of rules he had designed and defended. He opened a blank document, hesitating for a moment before typing out a phrase he had never imagined writing: performance metrics based on empathy, care, and human impact. He paused, staring at the words, feeling both fear and relief swirl inside him. Part of him wondered how the leadership team would react, how Daniel would react, but another part of him felt an unexpected gratitude toward Grace for showing him that kindness and quality were not enemies. He whispered to himself that maybe this was his chance to make things right, not just improve numbers, but improve lives. And that feeling, small at first, grew warm in his chest, nudging him to keep writing. Moments like this tend to shift everything in a story, and sometimes they end up being the kind of choices that echo much later, shaping consequences no one can see yet. This is the kind of turning point that doesn't look explosive on the outside, but moves the ground under someone's feet, the kind that always comes back stronger down the line. Ethan continued typing, building out a new KPI model where employees earned recognition for patience, for solving problems fully rather than fast, for taking a moment to help someone in distress, for building customer trust instead of racing through calls. He added sections encouraging teamwork, kindness, and flexibility, creating a framework that didn't punish humanity, but measured the benefits it produced. And with every line he wrote, his understanding deepened. He hadn't been leading a company, he had been steering a machine. Now he wanted something different, something that looked more like the warmth he had seen in that diner. When he finally saved the document, he sat back again and felt a strange mix of pride and fear. Pride for the change he wanted to bring, fear for the storm he knew was coming. He knew Daniel would fight it, he knew the board would question it, but he also knew he couldn't go back to pretending the old system worked, not after what he'd seen, not after what the data had revealed. And as he turned off his screen, a quiet thought settled in. This was only the beginning, and whatever came next would test more than just numbers. It would test his courage to stand by what he now believed was right. Ethan walked into the executive boardroom, holding the printed draft of the new KPI model, and for a moment the room felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that didn't come from air conditioning but from the weight of expectation. The long glass table reflected the nervous tap of his fingers as he laid the documents down, and he caught Daniel's eyes narrowing slightly, already sensing a shift in the air. The executives settled into their chairs, murmuring to each other while Ethan tried to steady his breathing. He began explaining the changes with a voice that carried both certainty and something softer, something that hadn't been there before. He spoke about empathy, kindness, trust, and how those things shaped real results, real loyalty. He shared the numbers he had uncovered, the turnover rates, the complaints, the burnout, each piece landing heavier than the last. For a moment, the room stayed quiet, and he hoped, just for a breath, that they would understand the truth he had finally allowed himself to see. But the silence broke, sharp and fast, when Daniel leaned forward, hands clasped like someone about to dismantle a fragile argument. Daniel said the new model was unrealistic, dangerous even, and that shareholders would revolt the moment they saw soft values replacing the speed metrics that had been the company's pride. He didn't hide his disbelief, almost laughing at the mention of rewarding acts of patience and care. Ethan tried to respond calmly, explaining how the current system punished people for being human, but the more he spoke, the more resistance rose around the table. Executives exchanged looks, shaking their heads, whispering doubts. Someone asked if Ethan was really willing to risk the company's growth for something that couldn't be measured on a chart. Someone else questioned whether customers even noticed acts of kindness. And another insisted that slowing people down would ruin productivity. Ethan felt the isolation grow inside him, with each objection, like a slow tightening around his chest. He searched the faces around the room, looking for even one person who saw the same truth he did. But all he found were the reflections of the system he had built, a system that had shaped these people just as much as it had shaped him. He kept going anyway, remembering the look on the young employee's face when she broke down in the lounge, remembering Marisol whispering that she hid her kindness, remembering Trevor admitting he helped co-workers behind the system's back just to make a moment easier for someone. And he remembered Grace, the way she moved without fear, without rushing, without sacrificing care. Her face drifted into his thoughts like a reminder of the world he wanted to build, not the one he had created. He mentioned her briefly, without saying her name, telling the board about a waitress who managed both service and humanity without losing quality. The room shifted again, this time not in doubt, but in discomfort, as if kindness itself had become a threat to the logic they depended on. Daniel stood then, walking slowly around the table, speaking in a tone that carried both confidence and challenge. He said the company didn't need stories, it needed numbers. He said leadership required hard choices, not soft ideals. And then, with a steady voice that cut through the air like a blade, he told Ethan that kindness doesn't pay. For a moment, Ethan didn't speak. The words hit him harder than expected, echoing through the boardroom like something final. He felt the weight of years pressed onto his shoulders, years of pushing people to be faster, years of believing speed was perfection. He realized then that the culture resisting him wasn't just built by others, it was built by him. The silence after Daniel's statement stretched long, uncomfortable, and Ethan sensed the board waiting for him to abandon the proposal, to step back into the familiar model that had made them powerful. The pressure filled the room so thick he felt it in his breath, in the tightness of his throat, in the way his hands curled slightly at his sides. He understood that he stood alone now, not because others had betrayed him, but because he had outgrown the empire he once built with pride. He looked back down at the documents, the new model he had crafted with such careful thought, and he knew it represented a path with no return. If he chose it, he risked losing support, reputation, control. If he abandoned it, he risked losing himself. The board members began discussing alternatives, arguing for stronger time metrics, suggesting the removal of anything that encouraged employees to slow down. Their voices blended into a low murmur, but Ethan didn't hear the details anymore. He heard only the question forming in the quiet corner of his mind, the question that would decide everything. And standing in that room, surrounded by the culture he no longer believed in, he realized the choice in front of him wasn't about charts or money or shareholders. It was about the kind of leader he wanted to be from this moment on, and whether he had the courage to step away from the system he once defended with everything he had. Ethan stayed in the boardroom long after everyone else had left, staring at the empty chairs as if they could still answer him. When he finally walked back to his office, the sun had already dipped behind the skyline, leaving only the glow of street lamps reflecting off the glass towers. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. The silence felt heavier than any argument, heavier than Daniel's voice insisting that kindness didn't pay. Ethan crossed the room, sat at his desk, and opened his laptop again, the screen lighting up his tired face. The new KPI model sat there waiting for him, the words crisp and simple, yet carrying a meaning that pulled him in deeper every time he read them. He thought about Grace, the way her hands had steadied the elderly woman, the way she had smiled at the frightened child, how she had moved like someone who believed every second mattered, for a different reason than he ever had. And he thought about the employees whose voices had cracked under pressure, whose lives bore the marks of a system that cared only for speed. Those memories tangled together, tightening around him like threads he couldn't escape. He rested his forehead against his hand, feeling the vulnerability he never allowed himself to show in front of others. For years he had been the man with answers, the one who never hesitated, the one who believed that anything emotional belonged outside the workday. Yet, now, the more he tried to return to the comfort of certainty, the more he felt something slipping out of his grasp. He whispered quietly, almost like an apology to the empty room, wondering how he had missed something so obvious. He remembered moments he had brushed off from his past, workers he pushed too hard, relationships he let fade because he didn't slow down, apologies he never made. The guilt was new, raw, almost sharp, but at the same time it felt like truth settling into its rightful place. He stood up and paced slowly, running his hand along the back of the sofa, feeling the cold leather under his palm. Every step brought him closer to a decision he knew he couldn't avoid. He could ignore what he had seen, pretend the system worked just fine, and keep the empire intact. Or he could rewrite everything, risk everything, and honor the humanity he had once treated like an inconvenience. He walked to the window and looked out at the city below, lights flickering like thousands of tiny choices being made all at once. Somewhere out there, Grace was probably finishing another shift, still helping people without thinking twice about it. He wondered how many lives she had touched in small ways, the kind of ripple effects he had never considered measuring. And he wondered what it would look like to build a company that rewarded moments like hers, that saw them not as delays, but as victories. The thought scared him and comforted him at the same time. He returned to his desk, sat down slowly, and opened the new KPI model again. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the page, waiting for the final note he hadn't written yet. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly, not from fear of failure, but from the fear of stepping onto a path with no guaranteed ending. The silence deepened, wrapping around him like a heavy blanket, pushing him toward a truth he could no longer run from. He took a breath, steady and full, and typed the final line, "Implement immediately." He stared at those words, feeling his heartbeat rise, not in panic, but in acceptance. He printed the document, held the warm pages in his hands, and felt a strange mix of sorrow and pride fill his chest. He knew he was stepping into a storm that could cost him everything he had built, but he also knew ignoring the truth would cost him something even greater. This decision wasn't about numbers or graphs anymore. It was about becoming someone he could respect, someone who understood that kindness wasn't weakness. With his hands still trembling, he placed the papers in a folder, set it on the edge of his desk, and whispered to himself that he was ready for whatever came next. Moments like this always make people think about choices they've faced in their own lives, the ones that felt impossible until they finally listened to their conscience. Let me know in the comments what you think Ethan should expect after this step, and if you enjoy stories that push characters to grow, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. He turned off the lights and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking back at the folder waiting on the desk like a quiet promise. The city hummed softly outside, and with one final breath, Ethan walked out, carrying the weight of his decision into the dark hallway, knowing that by morning, nothing would be the same again. Ethan arrived at the office before sunrise, the city still quiet beneath the fading blue of early morning. He walked through the halls with the same steady steps as always, but something in his posture had changed. The decision he'd made the night before gave his movements a strange mix of calm and fear, as if he were walking toward a ledge he had built himself. By the time employees began filling the lobby, he was already standing on the auditorium stage, the new KPI folder in his hand, waiting for the lights to come up. As the room filled, he watched the faces of the people who kept his company alive, some tired, some skeptical, some simply curious. When the final group settled into their seats, he took a breath that felt heavier than any speech he had ever delivered, and began. His voice was steady at first, describing the changes the company would be adopting, but as he shifted from numbers to the human side of the decision, something softened in him. He admitted the old system had gone too far, that it rewarded speed at the cost of compassion, and that starting today, kindness, teamwork, and full customer care would count just as much as efficiency. People blinked, unsure they had heard him correctly. A few employees in the front row covered their mouths, tears forming almost instantly. Others exchanged confused glances, as if waiting for him to reveal that this was some kind of test. Ethan kept going, explaining how every voice he had heard, every moment he had witnessed, had made it impossible to ignore what needed to change. He glanced toward the back of the room and saw Daniel standing with the other executives, arms crossed so tightly it looked painful. The more Ethan spoke, the more Daniel's expression hardened. When Ethan finished laying out the new metrics, Daniel moved forward, not bothering with a microphone, speaking loud enough for the entire room to hear. He said these changes would bring financial collapse, that customers didn't care about kindness, that the company's strength came from speed and nothing more. A murmur rippled across the audience, some agreeing, others shaking their heads. Ethan looked at Daniel, remembering every moment they had built this place together, the long nights, the tough deals, the victories. But now he also remembered Marisol's trembling voice, Trevor's secret acts of kindness, the young employee crying in the lounge, and Grace moving through the diner like empathy itself. He knew he couldn't unsee any of it. As he defended the new KPIs, his voice grew firmer, not louder, as if the truth itself was holding him upright. Employees began whispering again, but this time the energy felt different. Some faces relaxed, others filled with cautious hope, and behind all that a few executives looked ready to revolt. Daniel stepped closer, saying Ethan was making a dangerous mistake, a mistake that might destroy everything they had built. Ethan felt the tension in the room tighten like a string pulled too far, one snap away from chaos. For a moment he hesitated, the weight of risk pressing against his ribs. He could hear his heartbeat, feel the heat rising in his chest, and taste fear mixed with a strange sense of freedom. He knew the board would fight him. He knew shareholders might panic. He also knew that stepping back now would mean losing the person he was becoming. He looked out at the employees again, people who had carried his rules for years, people who had stayed late, pushed harder, sacrificed more than anyone ever saw. Some of them were crying quietly, not from fear, but from relief. Relief that someone finally understood what the work had cost them. This is one of those moments that forces a person to choose not just what kind of leader they want to be, but what kind of human being they're willing to become. If you were standing where Ethan is right now, risking everything for a moral shift, would you take the leap or hold on to safety? And what does choosing the harder path say about someone's character? Daniel shook his head slowly, saying the company couldn't survive ideals. That business had no room for softness. Ethan felt a calm rise inside him, the kind that comes right before a storm breaks. He told the room he wasn't abandoning numbers or goals. He was simply adding humanity back into the equation. The executives looked stunned. Employees leaned forward, listening with breaths held. Ethan closed his folder with a sense of finality, as though sealing a promise he couldn't take back. When he stepped away from the microphone, the auditorium didn't erupt in applause or outrage. It simply sat in a charged, electric silence, the kind that comes when everyone knows a single decision has shifted the future. And as Ethan walked off the stage, the tension followed him, clinging to his shoulders like a weight that would only grow heavier from here. But he didn't turn back. He knew the rebellion had just begun, and what came next would either break the company or rebuild it into something better than he ever imagined. Ethan felt the silence of the auditorium follow him long after he stepped backstage, like a shadow that wasn't sure whether to cling to him or let him go. The decision had been made. The words had been spoken aloud in front of hundreds of people. There was no turning back. By the next morning, the new KPIs were already circulating through email inboxes, printed on breakroom boards, and displayed on dashboards that had never before used words like patience or empathy. As he walked through the building, he noticed something small but unmistakable. People were moving a little slower, but not in a lazy way, more like they were finally breathing. A customer in the lobby asked for help, and for the first time in a long time, an employee actually stopped without glancing nervously at a timer. Another worker helped a co-worker carry a stack of boxes, both of them smiling shyly, almost like they were rediscovering something they had forgotten they were allowed to feel. Ethan felt hope rise inside him, warm and fragile, but real. That hope dimmed slightly when he reached the operations floor. Daniel was there, walking briskly from desk to desk, whispering to supervisors, pointing at screens, leaving behind a trail of worried expressions. Ethan watched him for a moment before stepping closer. Daniel didn't notice at first, too busy encouraging people to keep the old pace just in case, reminding them that investors would panic if numbers dipped even slightly. Ethan confronted him quietly, asking why he was undermining the rollout. Daniel paused, looked at him with a mix of pity and frustration, and said he was trying to protect the company from a mistake. Ethan replied that the mistake was pretending the old system worked. The tension between them thickened so sharply that even nearby employees stepped away. For the first time, Daniel didn't win the moment. He didn't fold Ethan back into old logic. Instead, he blinked, startled, as Ethan gently but firmly told him the transition was not optional and that fighting it would only hurt people further. Something shifted in Daniel's expression then, fear maybe, or the realization that the balance of power had finally changed. As the day went on, customer satisfaction messages began pouring in. People appreciated the workers taking time to explain things fully. Someone even wrote that it was the first time they felt a human being on the other end of the phone. A few supervisors sent Ethan thank you notes, simple lines saying the new rules gave them room to breathe again. That small gratitude warmed him in a way he hadn't expected. He thought about Grace again, about how natural kindness seemed in her hands, and he wondered how different his company would look if everyone felt free to work with that same warmth. Not everyone embraced it, though. A group of executives met behind closed doors, their voices rising through the glass as they argued about rocking the stock price. Ethan walked by that room and saw Daniel leading the discussion, pointing at charts, insisting the changes were dangerous. But when Daniel stepped out and saw Ethan standing there, he hesitated. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He simply asked whether Daniel had listened to a single employee in the last 24 hours. Daniel didn't answer. Moments like that tend to hit listeners in a personal way, because almost everyone has faced a moment where doing the right thing comes at a cost, and hearing characters choose courage reminds people of their own turning points. It's comforting to realize others have felt that same mix of fear and hope when standing up to someone with power, and seeing a story echo that feeling makes a lot of people feel less alone, part of something shared and understood. Later that afternoon, Ethan visited a customer service section he hadn't walked through since the early days of the company. He approached a young employee and asked how the new metrics felt. The young man said he was still nervous, but that for the first time he didn't feel punished for caring. Ethan nodded, feeling the truth of that settled deep inside him. He knew they weren't out of danger. He knew investors could still panic, the board could still move against him, and resistance could grow stronger before it weakened. But as he watched two co-workers laugh softly while helping an anxious customer, he felt something anchor inside him. The shift had begun, and no amount of pushback could unsee what people were feeling now. Daniel's resistance only confirmed how deeply the old system had rooted itself, how hard some people would fight to keep it. That wasn't the battle that scared Ethan anymore. What scared him, what thrilled him, was knowing the next steps would define everything, not just for the company, but for the person he was becoming, and the consequences waiting up ahead were already gathering like clouds just out of sight. Ethan felt the shift long before the email arrived. The building had grown tense again, not in the frantic way of the old system, but in a quieter, heavier way, like the air just before a storm. Whispers traveled through hallways, supervisors spoke cautiously, and even the employees who had embraced the changes moved with a careful hope, as if afraid something might come along and break it. When the emergency shareholder meeting request hit his inbox, the subject line alone sent a cold pressure down his spine. He knew this moment would come, but knowing didn't soften the impact. He read the short message twice, then 3 times, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something gentler. They didn't. He closed his laptop, straightened his jacket, and took the elevator down to the conference floor where the meeting was already being prepared. By the time he stepped inside, most of the board and several high-ranking investors were seated, their expressions a mix of concern, calculation, and impatience. Daniel sat among them, looking strangely calm, almost expectant. Ethan opened the meeting with a steady voice, explaining the purpose behind the new KPIs, the early reactions from staff, the unexpected rise in customer satisfaction, the signs that a healthier culture was emerging. Some board members nodded, others scribbled notes, but a handful looked openly skeptical. One investor leaned forward and asked how kindness could protect profit margins. Another questioned whether slowing down would damage quarterly performance. Ethan listened, hands clasped in front of him, feeling the tension in the room coil tighter with each question. Then he did something he hadn't planned. He told them the story of the diner. He described Grace's small gestures, the warmth she created, the way she managed to give excellent service without losing her humanity. He explained how that moment shattered the belief that speed alone was value. For a second, the room softened. A few eyebrows lowered, a few arms uncrossed. Grace, someone who didn't even work for the company, was suddenly in the meeting with them, her influence echoing across the table. He took that moment and brought out the early data from the transition, customer feedback praising the patience of employees, reports of fewer internal conflicts, supervisors noting that people no longer rushed with fear, but worked with steadier concentration. It wasn't perfection, not yet, but it was proof. Proof the old system had been hurting them more than helping. Daniel stood abruptly, calling the examples emotional tricks and asking the board to stay focused on long-term value. Ethan countered calmly, pointing out that long-term value was exactly what empathy created. The debate grew sharper. Voices overlapped. Some investors sided with Ethan, others with Daniel. The room tilted back and forth like a scale refusing to settle. Ethan kept his tone level, but inside he felt the pressure building in waves, each argument reminding him that the future of everything he'd built was hanging by a thread. Later that afternoon, the meeting paused so the board could review the documents in private. Ethan stepped out into the hallway feeling drained, like someone had pulled the strength from his legs. He leaned against the wall and looked out the window at the city below. The same view Grace would never know had been shaped by her simple kindness. As he stood there, a thought crossed his mind. Not fear of losing his position, but fear of failing the people who had trusted him with their stories, their tears, their quiet hopes that work could be human again. When the board called him back in, he walked through the door with his shoulders squared, not because he was sure he would win, but because he knew he couldn't go back to who he was before. Moments like this tend to change the direction of an entire life, and sometimes the consequences don't show up right away. They build slowly, quietly, then hit all at once, turning a single decision into a turning point no one forgets. And this meeting, tense as it was, felt like the kind of moment that would come back even stronger in what was waiting ahead. When the room settled again, the chairman cleared his throat and spoke with the tone of someone who had weighed every possibility. He said Ethan's proposal had enough merit to move forward, but not enough certainty to be adopted outright. The board wanted a final vote, one last meeting, one last chance for both sides to present a complete case. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the decision. Daniel's jaw tightened. This wasn't the total victory he had expected. The chairman scheduled the vote for the end of the week. No more debates until then. No more adjustments. Just time. Time for everyone to think, reflect, gather arguments, and brace themselves for whatever the final outcome would bring. As Ethan walked out of the conference room, the tension followed him like a second shadow. Employees looked up from their desks when he passed by, searching his face for any clue about what had happened. He gave them a small, steady smile, but inside his heart beat faster than ever. Everything was set in motion now. The next meeting would decide not just the future of the company, but the future of the culture inside it. The weight of the coming vote pressed on him with every step, reminding him that the most important moment was no longer ahead. It was already approaching, fast and unstoppable, waiting for him to face it with everything he had become. Ethan walked into the boardroom on the day of the vote, with a calm that didn't quite match the way his heart pounded inside his chest. The chairs were already arranged in a tight circle around the long table, the windows showing a grey morning settling over the city like a quiet warning. Daniel stood near the far end, organizing his papers with sharp movements, as if preparing for a battle he fully expected to win. The board members entered one by one, some nodding at Ethan with polite stiffness, others avoiding his eyes altogether. When everyone finally sat, the room fell into a silence that wrapped around them like a thick curtain, holding every breath in place. Ethan felt the weight of that stillness settle onto his shoulders, pressing against the back of his neck. He reached for the folder containing the new KPI model, the same one he had worked on in the middle of the night, the one that carried the entire soul of what he was fighting for. As he placed his hand on its cover, he felt a slight tremble run through him, a reminder that courage didn't erase fear. It only pushed it aside long enough to move. Daniel began the meeting with confidence, speaking before the chairman even invited him. His voice was steady, polished, familiar. He laid out graphs showing past profits, highlighting quarters where speed metrics drove numbers higher. He warned that changing the system at this scale would scare investors, cost millions, and weaken their competitive edge. He spoke about risk, stability, and measurable value. Every line seemed rehearsed down to the breath. Ethan watched him closely, noting the small twitch in his jaw, the slight strain in his eyes. Daniel wasn't just fighting for the company. He was fighting for a world he understood, a world where empathy was a distraction, a world Ethan once lived in too. When Daniel finished, he sat down with the air of someone who believed he had just delivered the winning blow. The chairman turned to Ethan. The room shifted toward him, dozens of eyes settling onto his face at once. He inhaled slowly, feeling the cold air hit his lungs like a wave. He stood up, hands lightly touching the folder, and began speaking in a voice quieter than Daniel's but somehow stronger. He told them about the employees he had spoken to, the fear in their voices, the pressure they carried. He described the burnout, the tears, the hidden acts of support workers offered each other because the system wouldn't allow it openly. Then he brought up Grace. He told them about a simple diner, a cheap meal and a waitress who chose kindness twice before finishing his order and still delivered better service than any stopwatch could measure. He saw the shift happen again, slow but real. A few members leaned forward. One woman nodded slightly. Someone else folded his hands as if reconsidering something deeply buried. As Ethan spoke, he felt something inside him settle into place, like aligning with a truth he'd always known but ignored. He explained how early data from the new KPIs showed rising customer satisfaction, fewer conflict reports, and employees expressing cautious relief. Not everything was perfect, but the direction mattered. The numbers didn't deny the truth. They supported it. He said plainly that an empire built only on speed would eventually collapse under its own weight, but one built on trust, care, and real service could grow stronger over time. His throat tightened near the end, not from fear but from emotion, the kind he had never allowed into this room before. When he finally finished speaking, a long silence followed, thicker than before. The board members looked at each other, weighing the two worlds placed in front of them. The chairman called for the vote. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then hands began to rise, one after another, some hesitant, some firm. Ethan counted silently, afraid to breathe too early. Daniel's hand stayed down, stiff at his side. More hands lifted. Ethan's heart pounded in his ears. Then one more hand rose, and another. The majority tipped, clear and unmistakable. The chairman announced that the new KPI system was approved. The words hit Ethan like a rush of air, filling him with a warmth that melted the tension gripping his chest. He felt his shoulders lower, the weight releasing all at once. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the relief wash through him. He wasn't triumphant for himself. He was relieved for the people who had trusted him, for the culture he had helped break, and now had the chance to rebuild. Daniel stood slowly, his face unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Shock, maybe, or hurt. Ethan didn't look away. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of disappointing him. He wasn't afraid of losing approval or stability. He had chosen the path he believed in. As the board members gathered their papers and the room slowly emptied, Ethan stood still, letting the moment root itself deeply inside him. This was the turning point. This was the moment he reclaimed the soul of the company he built. When the chairman shook his hand on the way out, Ethan felt a quiet sense of victory, not loud or showy, but warm and deep, the kind that changes a person from the inside out. And as he walked toward the window, looking at the city bathed in soft afternoon light, he knew the story wasn't over, but the hardest part was finally behind him. Ethan returned to the diner on a quiet morning when the city was just starting to wake up, the kind of morning where the light softened everything it touched. He pushed open the door and heard the same bell that had rung the first day he came in, but something inside him felt completely different now. He wasn't there to evaluate anything, wasn't there to test or measure or judge. He was there because this small, simple place had become the beginning of everything that had changed in him. Grace noticed him almost instantly. She froze mid-step, her eyes widening for a moment in confusion before she broke into a surprised smile. She walked toward him with the same warm energy she greeted every customer with, even at this early hour. She asked if he needed a table, but Ethan shook his head gently and told her he came for something else. The nervous laugh she let out made him realize she had no idea how deeply she had influenced his life, how her everyday kindness had started a wave inside him that had reached hundreds of people. He asked if they could speak for a moment, and she nodded, wiping her hands on her apron out of habit. He reached into his bag and took out the new company manual, thick and freshly printed. She frowned, confused, until he turned it around to show her the cover. There, in full color, was the photo he had taken with his phone the day he first visited the diner, a candid image of Grace helping the elderly woman with her purse, her expression soft and focused. Grace gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. She stared at the picture, then at him, then back at the picture again, as if trying to understand why she was there. Ethan explained everything in simple, honest words, how her acts of kindness had challenged his beliefs, How her way of working had shown him what his own company had been missing. How she had sparked a change he didn't know he needed. Grace's eyes welled up, but she laughed through the emotion, shaking her head in disbelief. She said she was just doing what anyone should do, but Ethan gently disagreed. Not everyone does it. Not everyone chooses humanity when pressured to rush. He watched her flip through the pages, her fingers trembling slightly as she saw entire sections dedicated to empathy, patience, and care. It felt surreal to her, almost too big to hold, and yet she stayed grounded the whole time, as if kindness had always been the most natural thing in the world. Ethan felt something settle inside him as he watched her smile, something quiet and full, like a long-held breath finally released. He didn't try to dramatize anything, didn't try to impress her with the scale of the change. He simply thanked her, not for saving his company, though she played a part in that, not for inspiring a transformation, though she certainly did. He thanked her for reminding him what it meant to be human in a world he had made too cold. Grace reached out and touched his arm lightly, her voice soft as she told him she was glad something good had come from such an ordinary moment. And somehow, that made the whole journey feel even more like a gift. A customer waved from the corner of the diner, and Grace excused herself, slipping back into her role as naturally as breathing. Ethan stayed where he was for a moment longer, watching her move from table to table with that same calm warmth that had changed everything. She straightened a placemat for an older man with a shaky hand, refilled a cup before the customer had to ask, and bent down to talk to a child who looked upset about a dropped spoon. Nothing about her was scripted. Nothing was forced. She simply cared, with no expectation of anything in return. Standing there, Ethan realized this was the perfect ending, not a grand speech, not a dramatic gesture, but watching her continue exactly as before, unaware of the quiet revolution her actions had sparked. When he finally stepped outside, the cold morning air hit him gently, carrying the smell of fresh pastries from the bakery next door. He smiled to himself, feeling lighter, steadier, and more certain than ever that he had made the right choice. He walked down the sidewalk without rushing, without checking the time, without measuring the minutes. The city moved around him in its usual hurried way, but he didn't cling to that rhythm anymore. For the first time, he felt in sync with something deeper and calmer, something that felt more like truth. He glanced back once through the diner window and saw Grace laughing with a customer, sunlight catching her hair. That image settled into his memory like a final chapter, closing gently but firmly, carrying the weight of everything he had learned. He realized then that life had a way of teaching people through the smallest moments, and that sometimes the most important turning points come from people who never try to be teachers at all. With that thought, he turned the corner and disappeared into the flow of the street, carrying the warmth of the diner with him like a quiet promise of the person he would continue to be from now on. Before we close this story, let me ask you something that might stay with you long after the video ends. What would you have done in Ethan's place? Would you risk everything to change the world around you, even if it meant standing alone for a while? And who is the Grace in your life? The person whose simple kindness changed something inside you without even knowing it. Pause for a moment and share your thoughts, your opinions, your experiences. Someone else listening might need to hear your perspective. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you made it here, comment your first and last name, so I know you're part of this circle that truly listens. Leave a like to help this work keep growing, and subscribe so more stories like this can reach you. And if this tale touched you because kindness changed a life, the next story will shake you even deeper, because sometimes kindness reveals secrets we didn't know were there. Click on the next video and come with me. There's a lot more waiting for you on the other side.